On the night of October 14, 2003, Raymond Acker finished embalming a body, washed the formaldehyde from his hands, and walked into the break room of Halverson and Sons funeral home in Duluth, Minnesota, where he found a photograph of himself and his brother taped to the missing persons flyer sitting on the counter. The body in room 3 was his brother, Dennis. By the time you finish watching this video, you will understand how a trained mortician spent 4.5 hours working on a corpse without recognizing his own flesh and blood, and you will understand why that fact, disturbing as it is not even close to the most terrifying thing about this story. Because Raymond Acker didn't just embalm his brother. When he finally opened his appointment book for the following week, he found 11 more names. All of them Ackers. All of them family. To understand how any of this was possible, you need to go back to the beginning. Not the night Raymond found the flyer, but 18 months earlier, to the slow, quiet unraveling of a family that most people in their small community considered perfectly ordinary. The Acker family had deep roots in Carleton County, Minnesota. Raymond was the eldest of 7 siblings, born in 1961 to Harold and June Acker, who had built a modest life on a patch of land outside the town of Moose Lake, about 40 miles south of Duluth. Harold had worked the paper mill. June had kept house. They were the kind of people who showed up to church on Sunday and whose names you only ever heard in neutral, forgettable contexts: a school fundraiser, a county fair, a retirement party at the Elks Lodge on Cedar Street. Nothing memorable. Nothing dark. At least that was the surface. Raymond had left Moose Lake at 22 and never really gone back. He'd apprenticed under a mortician in Duluth named Gerald Halverson, a meticulous, soft-spoken man who smelled perpetually of cedar and antiseptic and who believed, with genuine conviction, that the work of preparing the dead was a sacred obligation. Raymond had absorbed that belief completely. By the time he was in his late 30s, he was the senior embalmer at Halverson and Sons, working Tuesday through Saturday, living alone in a one-bedroom apartment on West Superior Street, and maintaining what his coworkers described as a professional detachment that occasionally crossed the line into something colder. He wasn't unkind. He was precise. There is a difference, though it's a fine one, and the people who worked alongside Raymond Acker understood it without being able to articulate it. His colleague, a woman named Paula Vetch who had worked the front desk for 9 years, once told a local reporter that Raymond could walk into the preparation room and become a different person. Not cold, just elsewhere, like he'd learned to put himself someplace else while his hands did the work. That skill, that cultivated emotional distance, is the reason Raymond Acker spent 4.5 hours with his brother Dennis on the preparation table and never once felt the recognition that should have been instinctive. Dennis was 41 years old. He had Raymond's same square jaw, the same broad forehead, the same thick knuckles on wide hands. But Dennis had been missing for 6 weeks by the time his body arrived at Halverson and Sons on the morning of October 14, 2003, and he had not arrived looking like himself. The paperwork said the deceased was a John Doe, a male, approximately 40 to 45 years of age, recovered from a tributary of the St. Louis River near the township of Scanlon on October 12. Water recovery cases were not uncommon, and they were not pleasant. The body had been in the water long enough that Raymond worked from documented measurements and a general physical description rather than anything resembling a familiar face. He had no reason to look for his brother. As far as he knew, Dennis was simply gone. One of those family members you lose contact with slowly, across years, through a series of unreturned calls and skipped holidays and distances that grow without anyone making a conscious decision to let them. And what the Carleton County Sheriff's Department discovered when they began pulling the threads of this case would eventually force investigators to re-examine every assumption they had made about the Acker family, and about what had been happening in that farmhouse outside Moose Lake for nearly 2 decades. Raymond set down the photograph. His hands, he would later tell detectives, were not shaking. He walked back to the preparation room door. He put his hand on the frame. And then he opened his appointment book to the following week's schedule, because he needed to know, needed to confirm, that what he was seeing couldn't possibly be real. It was real. 11 names. 11 Ackers. Beginning the following Monday morning at 9 o'clock. And every single one of them was already dead. Raymond Acker stood in the doorway of the preparation room for a long time. Long enough that the fluorescent light above him buzzed through 3 full cycles before he moved. He was looking at the name on the gurney's intake tag, John DOE, Carleton County, October 12, 03, and he was looking at the photograph on the missing person's flyer, and he was doing the thing that the human mind does when it is given two contradictory truths and refuses to let them occupy the same space. He was choosing one and rejecting the other. He was choosing the intake tag. It took the arrival of Detective Sergeant Louis Bream of the Carleton County Sheriff's Department at 11:47 that night to collapse the distance between the two truths completely. Bream was a compact, deliberate man in his late 40s who had spent 22 years working cases in a part of Minnesota where most crimes were the product of economic desperation, domestic deterioration, or the particular kind of hopelessness that winters at this latitude can manufacture in a person over time. He was not easily surprised. But when he sat across from Raymond Acker in the break room of Halverson and Sons and watched the Mortician slide the appointment book across the table with a steadiness that was almost clinical, Bream later said he felt something he could only describe as the ground tilting underneath him. 11 names. He recognized most of them immediately. Carla Acker, Thomas Acker, Ruth Acker, née Bostrom, who had married into the family in 1987. James Harold Acker, who was 17 years old. Patricia Acker, Dale Acker, and 5 others, ranging in age from 19 to 63, all connected to the same bloodline, the same 40 acres outside Moose Lake, the same farmhouse at the end of a gravel road that the Carleton County Sheriff's Department had visited twice in the preceding 8 months on wellness check calls that had produced nothing actionable. Both times, deputies had noted that the property appeared occupied but that no one had answered the door. Both times they had left. Bream looked at Raymond and asked him who had scheduled the appointments. Raymond told him he didn't know. He hadn't scheduled them. He didn't recognize the handwriting. The handwriting was not Raymond's. It was not Paula Vetch's. It was not Gerald Halverson's, who was 71 years old by then and had largely retired from the administrative side of the business. A forensic document examiner would later spend 3 weeks analyzing the script and conclude, with a probability she described as near certain, that the 11 names had been written by the same hand, and that the hand belonged to someone who had written in that book before. Someone who had regular access to the scheduling system at Halverson and Sons. Someone who had been inside that building alone on multiple occasions. But that revelation was still weeks away. On the night of October 14th, what Bream had in front of him was simpler and more immediately terrible. 11 members of the same family had been listed for preparation and burial at a funeral home in Duluth, and as far as anyone could determine, no one had reported any of them dead. Which meant one of two things. Either the appointments were the work of someone who was planning to kill 11 people, or the 11 people were already gone, and someone had been disposing of them carefully, methodically, and in plain sight, using the administrative infrastructure of a legitimate funeral home as a filing system. The Carleton County Sheriff's Department, in coordination with the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, drove out to the farmhouse on the morning of October 15th with 4 deputies, 2 investigators, and a search warrant that had been drafted and signed in under 3 hours, a speed that Judge Patricia Helmer would later say reflected the particular urgency of the request and the particular pallor of Louis Bream's face when he stood before her at 2 in the morning and laid out what he knew. The gravel road was soft from recent rain. The farmhouse at the end of it was dark. A porch light had been left on, and it illuminated a front door that was standing slightly open, swinging very gently in the October wind, as if someone had just walked through it and not bothered to pull it closed behind them. Inside the house, they found evidence of habitation stretching back decades. Dishes in the sink. A calendar on the wall still turned to August. A television set in the corner of the living room with a crack across its screen. School photographs arranged in a line along the hallway, 7 children aging forward through the years in that particular sequential way that family photographs track a life, and then stopping all of them at a specific point in time. The most recent photograph in the hallway was dated 1987. Nothing after that. 16 years of photographs simply absent. Bream walked through each room slowly. His investigator, a woman named Sandra Mote who had been with the BCA for 11 years, and who was not prone to theatrical reactions, stopped at the entrance to the basement staircase and stood there for a moment with her flashlight aimed downward. Then she turned around and looked at Bream, and she said very quietly that he needed to call for additional personnel before they went any further. He asked her why. She told him to look at the temperature reading on the wall-mounted thermostat at the top of the stairs. The house was cold. The heat had not been running. But the basement was reading 14 degrees warmer than the floors above it. And the smell coming up from the bottom of those stairs was one that Raymond Acker, 4.5 hours north of them, would have recognized immediately. Bream called for the additional personnel. While they waited, Sandra Moat walked the perimeter of the kitchen and noted something that had not been immediately visible on their entry. A second appointment book, this one older and spiral-bound, sitting on the kitchen counter next to a coffee mug and a ballpoint pen. She photographed it without opening it. When the forensic team arrived and processed it, they found entries going back to April of 1999. Names, dates, times. All formatted identically to the scheduling entries in the book at Halverson and Sons. All written in the same hand. 47 entries over 4 years. 47 names. The Acker family plot at St. Malachy Cemetery in Moose Lake contained 22 marked graves. The oldest dated to 1931. The newest marker had been placed in September of 2003, 3 weeks before Raymond Acker embalmed his brother Dennis without knowing it. And it bore the name of a woman named Lorraine Acker, Harold and June's youngest daughter. Raymond's youngest sister. She was 38 years old. Raymond had not been notified of her death. He had not been invited to the funeral. When investigators later pulled the death certificate, they found it had been filed by a single individual listed as the family's authorized representative, a person whose name Raymond Acker, when shown it in an interview room 3 days later, stared at for 45 seconds without speaking. Because the name on that death certificate, the name that appeared on 21 of the 22 most recent death certificates filed for members of the Acker family across Carleton County, was Raymond's own. His signature, his information, his mortician's license number, registered with the state of Minnesota since 1988. Raymond Acker had allegedly buried half his family. He had no memory of any of it. And somewhere in that farmhouse basement, behind a door that Bream's team had not yet opened, something was still keeping the temperature 14 degrees warmer than the frozen Minnesota air pressing in through every crack in those old farmhouse walls. Louis Bream put his hand on the basement door. He looked at Sandra Moat. He looked at the spiral-bound appointment book, now sealed inside an evidence bag, with its 47 entries and its 4 years of meticulous, careful record-keeping. And then his radio crackled, and the deputy stationed outside told him that a vehicle had just turned onto the gravel road, moving slowly, headlights off, and that it had stopped approximately 30 yards from the front of the house. The driver's door had opened. Someone had gotten out. And whoever it was knew exactly where the front door was, because they were walking toward it in the dark without a flashlight, moving through that black October field with the steady, unhurried confidence of someone who had made this walk before. Many, many times before. Louis Bream stepped back from the door. He did it instinctively, the way a man does when something ancient in his nervous system overrides 22 years of professional training and simply tells him to create distance. He motioned to Sandra Moat without speaking. She understood. Both of them moved to the side of the hallway, backs against the wall, hands on their weapons, listening to the sound of footsteps crossing the porch. Slow, even, deliberate, and then stopping just outside the open door. A figure stepped into the light. She was 63 years old. She was wearing a barn coat, dark green, with a wool collar turned up against the October cold. Her hair was white and pulled back severely from a face that was deeply lined and completely, profoundly calm. She was carrying a casserole dish covered in aluminum foil, and she was holding it in both hands in front of her chest the way you carry something heavy and warm, and she looked at Louis Bream and Sandra Moat and the 2 deputies behind them as though she had been expecting them for some time and was mildly irritated that it had taken them this long. Her name was June Acker. She was 71 years old, not 63. Bream would correct that assessment later, noting that she appeared younger than she was, which he found, in retrospect, profoundly unsettling. She was Harold Acker's widow. She was Raymond's mother. And she set the casserole dish on the kitchen counter, folded the aluminum foil back neatly at one corner, turned to face Louis Bream and said, without being asked a single question, that she supposed they had found the book. That was the word she used. The book. Singular. As if there were only one that mattered. Bream told her there were 2. She nodded slowly. She said that made sense. She said that Raymond had always been thorough. It took 3 more hours and 2 interviews, one at the farmhouse and one at the Carleton County Sheriff's Department, before the shape of what June Acker had done, and what she believed she had arranged, became something that investigators could hold in their minds as a coherent thing rather than a collection of impossibilities stacked on top of each other. Here is what had happened. Here is what the investigation ultimately established. Harold Acker had died in January of 1999 from a cardiac event, genuine and unassisted, at the age of 74. But Harold had died in debt. Deep structural debt, the kind that accumulates across decades through bad decisions and pride and a stubborn refusal to ask for help, and the kind that, when it finally comes due, doesn't just take a house. It takes everything attached to the house. The land, the equipment, the name on the deed, all of it. June Acker had known about the debt for years. What she had not known, until the week after Harold's funeral, was that Harold had also carried a substantial life insurance policy, and that the policy had a provision she had never been informed of, buried in language she had never been equipped to parse, that excluded payout in cases where the named beneficiaries could not be individually verified as living. June Acker was not an educated woman, but she was, in the most literal sense of the word, a resourceful one. And sometime in the spring of 1999, she had come to a conclusion that the human mind is not supposed to be able to reach, that the cleanest solution to her problem was to make her family small enough that the verification process became manageable. She had not killed anyone. That is the detail that investigators would spend the longest time processing, and the detail that would make the prosecution of June Acker one of the most procedurally complex cases in Carleton County's history. She had not killed anyone. What she had done was something colder and, in certain respects, more deliberate. She had waited. Harold's death had given her a template. People died on that farm. They had always died on that farm. The winters were brutal, the work was physical, and the Ackers, like many families in that part of Minnesota, had a medical history that did not favor longevity. June had simply begun documenting those deaths privately, in a spiral-bound appointment book she kept on the kitchen counter, rather than reporting them through official channels. When a family member died on that property, of natural causes, of accident, of the accumulated weight of rural poverty and isolation, June did not call the county. She called no one. She maintained the appearance of habitation. She collected whatever income could be collected on their behalf. And she used her eldest son's name, his license number, and his professional signature, forged across 21 death certificates filed at irregular intervals over 4 years, to give those deaths a legal existence that routed entirely through the administrative infrastructure of Halverson and Sons Funeral Home in Duluth. Raymond's signature was on those certificates because June had spent years collecting samples of it. From birthday cards, from legal documents she had asked him to review, from a property dispute filing in 1994 that he had signed without knowing she had made a photocopy. She had practiced the signature. She had practiced it for a long time. The basement of the farmhouse contained a preservation setup of startling sophistication for a woman with no formal training, a fact that investigators attributed to 40 years of watching animals slaughtered and stored on a working farm, and to a particular, terrible kind of practical intelligence. The individuals whose names appeared in the kitchen appointment book had been maintained there through the winter months, when the ground was too hard for burial, before being interred in the family plot at St. Malachy's in spring and summer, documented with forged certificates, and entered into the scheduling system at Halverson and Sons, a system June had accessed through a key she had obtained from Raymond's apartment during a visit in 2001, ostensibly to water his plants while he was at a professional conference in Minneapolis. The 11 names in Raymond's appointment book for the following week were not people she intended to kill. They were the final entries in a ledger she was trying to close. 6 of those 11 individuals had already been interred in the family plot. 5 of them were in the basement. Dennis had drifted from the property after his death, a fall near the river unwitnessed, and had not been recovered in time for June's system to contain him. His presence at Halverson and Sons as a county John Doe rather than a June-managed intake was the single variable she had not controlled, and it was the thread that unraveled everything. Raymond Acker was never charged. The investigation concluded that his signature had been forged, that his license had been used without his knowledge or consent, and that his profound emotional detachment from his family of origin, built across 30 years of deliberate distance, had made him simultaneously the perfect instrument and the most credible witness against his own mother. He gave 27 hours of testimony across 9 separate interviews. His colleague Paulovich later said that he delivered all of it in the same register in which he described any other technical procedure. Precise, thorough, and somewhere else. June Acker was charged with fraud, abuse of a corpse, and obtaining property by deception. Charges that reflected the genuinely labyrinthine question of what crime category contains a woman who did not murder her family but who managed their deaths as a financial instrument for 4 years. She was convicted on all counts in November of 2005 and sentenced to 11 years. She served 6 before dying in the Shakopee Correctional Facility in August of 2011 of a cardiac event, which her attending physician described as sudden and unforeseeable. The family plot at St. Malachy's was exhumed. 21 bodies were recovered, identified, and reinterred with proper documentation. Dennis Acker was buried in the plot as well, finally carrying his own name on his own marker. Raymond attended the service. He stood at the graveside for a long time after the other mourners had gone. Whatever he was doing standing there, grieving, accounting, simply being present in a place he had spent 30 years avoiding, he did it alone, and he did not discuss it with anyone afterward. He returned to work the following Tuesday. He prepared 3 bodies that week. He was, by all accounts, precise. The question that Louis Bream carried with him after the case closed, the question he admitted to in an interview conducted for a BCA training document in 2007, was not about June Acker's method or her motive or even the extraordinary patience required to maintain what she had built for 4 years without a single person looking closely enough to see it. The question was simpler than that, and it had no satisfying answer. It was this: at what point, exactly, does a family become something else? At what point does the word stop meaning what you were told it meant, and become instead a system, a mechanism, a set of names in a book managed by someone you trusted, for purposes you were never meant to understand? Raymond Acker embalmed his brother without recognizing him because he had trained himself not to see. June Acker buried her children without consequence for 4 years because everyone around her had trained themselves not to look. The most dangerous thing in this story is not a woman with a casserole dish and a forged signature. It is the assumption, shared by Raymond, by the Carleton County Sheriff's Department, by the neighbors and the deputies who knocked on that door twice and left, that ordinary-looking things are ordinary. That a porch light left on means someone is home. That a family that shows up in neutral, forgettable contexts is a family that is whole. Sometimes the darkest rooms are the ones with the lights still burning. Every week, Mindshift Stories brings you the cases that keep investigators awake at night, the ones too disturbing for mainstream media. If that sounds like something you need, subscribe now and never miss a story.